Hi, this is Buzz Allen, back again for the propaganda game. This is the second video in a series of 6 dealing with the techniques in each of the sections in the game. This video deals with techniques of language. This is how propaganda methods use shades of meaning or other kinds of linguistic devices to persuade and cajole listeners into changing their attitude towards an idea or a product. Again, if we want to see the chart for all the techniques, we click on the pearl in the center of the selection screen for starting the game, and we see the 8 techniques shown under the language section. They are emotional terms, metaphor and simile, emphasis, quotations out of context, abstract terms, vagueness, ambiguity, and shift of meaning. An emotional term is a word or phrase that it may have some factual information in it, but the important thing about it from the point of view of a propaganda technique is that it conveys and expresses and arouses strong feelings for or against an object or idea. Now there are situations, non-controversial situations, where it's appropriate to express emotional feelings and arouse them. A church service, poetry, and some other literary forms. In these situations, we expect to hear emotional terms, and that's in fact the reason people are attending a session like that or engaging in that form of literature. But in propaganda techniques, emotional terms are being used to attempt to manipulate and to control how we view certain ideas. Our example is a quote from Adolf Hitler. "Universal education is the most corroding and disintegrating poison liberalism ever has created for its own destruction." Considering the source, if you are setting out to become one of the greatest fascist leaders in the world, to conquer the entire earth, to convert your society from an open democracy into a totally controlled fascist state so as the people will wage war on all your neighbors and murder millions of people, probably having an informed, educated populace is not helpful to your aim. So considering the source that this quote came from, we can all understand his perspective, I guess. But clearly he's using extremely emotional terms here, and did in many of his speeches, to try to arouse public opinion against, of all things, universal education. The second technique is metaphor and simile. Both metaphor and simile are actually literary devices that involve making a comparison. With a metaphor, the comparison is implied. It's not explicitly stated. In the case of a simile, the comparison is actually explicitly stated by using words like as or like. Something is like something else. Something is as something else. Our example is a delightful quote from Mark Twain, in which he says, "Teaching is like trying to hold 35 corks underwater at once." And anyone who's engaged in teaching understands the challenge when you have a class of 35 students of designing your lessons so that they actually address each of those students' needs and those differing capabilities of comprehension. Twain was also not necessarily a great fan of institutionalized education. One of his famous other quotes is that never let your schooling interfere with your education. This simile that he chose may also have something to do with the fact that the task of teaching seems to be to hold all those corks underwater. One doesn't know. But in any case, on either level, this quote is a wonderful example of simile. Emphasis is a propaganda technique, and this occurs when one is taking another speaker or writer's words and emphasizing only certain phrases or certain words in order to imply something that would otherwise not have been originally intended from the mouth of the original source. Oral emphasis will often do this by pitch or tone or the volume of voice or pauses. Written emphasis is done with italicizing or underlining. Now, a proper secondary author will, if they are placing specific emphasis on certain phrases, will actually acknowledge that the italics were theirs. But someone who is attempting to put words in someone's mouth will not do that. But Mom, you told me not to take any cookies, so Susie did it. So little Johnny's not going to get off the hook here. He's putting words in his mother's mouth. She didn't want any cookies to be eaten between meals, and it didn't really matter to whose hand was in the jar. But Johnny is attempting here to use the sleight of hand by emphasizing who she told not to take cookies, implying that anyone else would have a free access. The next technique is called quotation out of context. Most of us have heard this before. A quotation out of context is a technique when quoting the original statement without its context distorts the original meaning. This is often done by taking just a few of the words, and the context for a statement is not merely just the words that precede and follow it, but also the accompanying circumstances. And it could be the time and place, or a gesture, or a facial expression. Our example here is a film critic writes, "This has been the best movie I've seen all year. Of course, it's the only movie I've seen all year." And a newspaper review attempting to pump the movie says, "Best movie I've seen all year," says famous film critic. Obviously leaving out the second qualifying sentence casts the review in a very different light. And that is usually the intention when statements are quoted out of context. An abstract term is a general word or symbol that stands for the qualities possessed in common by a number of things or facts or events. The propaganda technique of using abstract terms occurs when someone uses a general term but is unable or unwilling to identify concrete instances or facts to which the word actually refers. Famous recent example of this occurred with a quote by Kellyanne Conway, who is an aide to the Trump administration. She was commenting on a quote made by Sean Spicer, who was the White House press secretary, regarding the Trump inauguration being the largest one ever witnessed. And Kellyanne said to the press, "You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving," well, Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. So the phrase alternative facts became a kind of a hallmark for elevating a demonstrable lie to some kind of alternative reality. And alternative facts is in fact an abstract term, and it's not appropriate to use it just for whatever idea you don't happen to agree with or you wish was somehow being reported differently. Vagueness. We all have heard the word vagueness before. To call a word vague is basically saying that there are certain marginal situations that arise where there's doubt as to whether the word should have been used in describing a particular situation. The meaning of the word is not precise enough to apply in the situation in which you're using it. This example is a meme from Facebook. It says, Isn't it strange how mental illness hardly massacres anyone in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom? Obviously, this was trying to get readers to think about the impact of the differences in gun regulations in nations like Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, Japan, where they have very low rates of mass shootings. And that is different than in America, where we have the highest level of it in the world. And but they certainly could have quoted statistics, and they could have quoted specific information. Instead, they just made a vague reference to mental illness hardly massacres anyone. And so this would be an example of using vagueness. Ambiguity is when a particular word or phrase is used in such a way that it has two or more meanings, and the person hearing it is unsure as to what is really meant. Our example comes from a television shot in which the headline says, "Cheeseburger stabbing." Now, just looking at this, and the picture is all you hear, it's not clear whether someone stabbed someone else over a cheeseburger, someone stabbed someone else with a cheeseburger, someone stabbed a cheeseburger, or a cheeseburger stabbed someone, or a cheeseburger stabbed another cheeseburger. Obviously, ambiguity can be used in lighthearted ways or to tell jokes, and that's very commonly done. Shift of meaning is different than ambiguity. Ambiguity is when the same word has more than one meaning. Shift of meaning is when a word is used more than once in a phrase or an argument, and it has different meanings at different points in time. This can also occur between two people who are arguing, where one person uses a word with implying a certain meaning, and another person uses the same word but applies a different meaning to it. One of the more laudable and famous uses of shift of meaning occurs in the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C., where the inscription says, "Freedom is not free." Clearly, the word free and the word freedom is alluding to freedom of choice and freedom of expression that we have in our democracy. And the second use of the word free refers to the actual cost in human lives and sacrifice in order to preserve the democracy we have and preserve those free choices. It's not the case that all uses of propaganda are necessarily nefarious. In this case, this was a patriotic attempt to have people consider the sacrifices made to preserve our way of life. But this is shift of meaning. Famous Irish blessing: "May the road rise up to meet you, may the wind always be at your back, may the sun shine warm upon your face, and rains fall soft upon your fields, and until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand." Obviously, these are words that invoke emotional upwelling in the person listening to it, but this is actually a prayer. So in this situation would not be considered a propaganda technique, but in fact an appropriate use of emotional terms. So this is if this example were in a game, the appropriate response probably is to vote no technique. So that concludes the techniques that are part of Section B, language techniques. The next video is dealing with irrelevance, techniques that involve the use of irrelevant ideas to try to persuade and manipulate.